Welcome to the Deep Dives, where we unpack a stack of incredible sources to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge.
Our mission, to get you instantly well-informed with surprising facts and, well, just enough humor to keep you hooked.
Today we're diving into an idea so audacious, it might just make you question everything you thought you knew about the past. I mean, really question it. What if the history we know, the one with its neat timelines and distinct civilizations, is actually a brilliantly crafted illusion?
Not just a mistake, right, but a master forgery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Specifically designed, maybe, to shape our perception of reality.
It's a truly striking thought, isn't it? And our guide for this journey today is Michael Anthony Alberta's book, Encrypted Reality, Interpreting History's Patterns.
Right.
It's a deep dive that fundamentally challenges, well, our whole collective memory.
Absolutely. Alberta's core claim is, well, it's that much of what we accept as ancient history is a deliberately fabricated narrative.
He paints quite a picture, describes it as a map of distortions, repetitions, and gaps supposedly carefully assembled during the Renaissance.
Yeah, and he likens it to holding an old photograph up to the light, and seeing another image like a faint ghost bleeding through from the other side.
That's a great analogy.
It really is. And this isn't just some abstract theory. He presents it as a call to re-examine the very foundations of our historical understanding.
And importantly, this deep dive isn't about just throwing out history entirely. That's not the point.
No.
Instead, Alberta offers what he calls intellectual lockpicks.
Lockpicks, okay.
He's inviting us to kind of turn history over in our hands, to inspect it really closely for seams, for those subtle places where it might have been stitched and restitched.
So our mission today is basically to explore these very tools, these lockpicks he provides to interrogate this potential fabricated past.
That's the plan.
So what will you, the listener, gain from this journey? Well, you'll discover a fresh method for seeing historical patterns, not just isolated facts.
Yeah, and you'll acquire a critical lens, a way to examine how narratives get constructed, even if you don't, agree with every single one of Alberta's conclusions.
Right. This deep dive aims to equip you to, as he puts it, interrogate history, cross-examine it, and decide for yourself what to record as truth.
It's about empowering your own inner historical detective, really.
I like that. Okay, let's jump right into this radical premise then. Conventional historical scholarship, as we generally know it, relies on pretty meticulous methods, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, that's tree ring dating, and the careful analysis of distinct archaeological layers, stratigraphy.
And these methods, by and large, they support a linear progression of history, don't they?
Yeah.
Where diverse cultures evolved independently over these vast spans of time.
That's the standard view, yes. And Alberta doesn't necessarily deny the rigorous application of these scientific methods. He acknowledges they are absolutely fundamental to academic historical work, but he urges us to look beyond just the surface results, to examine the underlying assumptions behind these methods. He's looking for subtle inconsistencies, recurring patterns that might point towards something more profound.
Like a deliberate hand guiding things.
Perhaps. An orchestrated hand, as he might put it, guiding the constriction of the historical narratives we've inherited.
Okay, so if we're trying to spot these shadows in history, as Alberta calls them, what's the very first intellectual lockpick he hands us? Where do we start?
He says we have to start by questioning the calendar, not just the content. Rule number 1.
Question the calendar itself.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this is fundamental. Alberta argues that dates aren't these sacred, immutable labels we often treat them as.
Right.
They can be swapped, apparently, sometimes by centuries. The idea is to just imagine sliding events forward or backward in time and seeing if they still make sense.
Or maybe make more sense in a different spot.
Exactly, in a different chronological context. It really challenges our ingrained trust in the fixed linearity of time that we get from textbooks.
That's fascinating. It really makes you think. Okay, what's the next tool in this historical detective kit? Rule 2.
Next, rule 2, he suggests we hear the beat, not the lyrics.
Hear the beat, not the lyrics. Okay, unpack that a bit.
It means that while the specific details might change, the names of kings, the locations of battles, the specific doctrines, the overarching patterns often endure.
Okay.
Wars, plagues, major discoveries, religious upheavals, these frequently appear as echo events, repeating across different cultures with maybe only the surface elements altered.
So the goal is to track these echoes, these recurring melodies, you could say.
Precisely. Track them to find their original source, or at least identify a common underlying pattern.
It's like history has this recurring soundtrack, maybe just played with different instruments each time.
Mm.
Interesting. What's rule number 3 for this detective work?
The third rule is to follow the fingerprints.
Fingerprints. Like forensic evidence.
Sort of. Certain materials, unique symbols, or distinct architectural signatures can act like calling cards, revealing that the same hand or the same network has been at work.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about maybe the specific type of volcanic glass, obsidian, used in tools across supposedly different cultures or times, or the cryptic curves in an illuminated manuscript that look oddly similar to another one centuries apart, or even a unique structural signature in ancient stonework.
So these motifs could point to a common origin, even across apparently separate periods or places.
That's the idea. It's about recognizing subtle, unique signatures that seem to span time and space in ways they maybe shouldn't.
That makes sense. Okay, and then a truly critical one for any detective. Treat every source as a suspect. Rule 4.
Absolutely crucial. Official chronicles, newly rediscovered manuscripts, even museum artifacts. Alberta says each is guilty until proven innocent.
The guilty until proven innocent. Wow.
He urges us to look actively for signs of fabrication, things like anachronistic language, wording that doesn't fit the supposed time period.
Or maybe identical errors across copies that are supposed to be independent.
Exactly. Or just a too-perfect survival in archives. How did this specific document survive fire, flood, and centuries of neglect perfectly intact?
It's exactly what a good detective does, isn't it? Examining every piece of evidence for inconsistencies, for anything that just doesn't quite add up.
Precisely.
Given that, it seems to lead logically to rule number 5. Assume intelligence, not accident. What is the thinking behind that one?
Well, if you see a consistent pattern spanning centuries of erasure, invention, and maybe convenient redating of events, Alberta argues it points towards deliberate design.
Not just random chance.
Right. Coincidence certainly exists in history. We see it all the time. But a pervasive, consistent pattern of historical manipulation across diverse sources, that's far less likely to be accidental, he suggests. It implies a guiding hand, a purpose behind the alterations.
Okay. And finally, rule number 6. Keep the what-if alive. How does speculation fit into this re-examination? Isn't history supposed to be about facts?
It is, but Alberta's reconstructions, as he presents them, are built on both documented fact and informed speculation. He stresses that the speculative threads aren't necessarily weaknesses in his argument.
How so?
He sees them as the probes, the questions that reveal where the official narrative might be weak, where it can't hold up under scrutiny. It's about using hypothetical scenarios, the what-ifs, to test the robustness of established accounts, pushing against the narrative to see where it bends or breaks.
So the official timeline in this view is like that master forgery you mentioned. Beautiful, skillfully aged, but potentially painted over another earlier image.
That's the analogy he uses, yeah. And our task in this deep dive is to try and scrape away that upper layer, revealing maybe the faint outlines or even entire scenes the original artist or the forger never intended us to see.
What's the relevance then of this really radical way of thinking for our lives today? Why should we care about potentially forged ancient history?
Well, it's not just an academic exercise, is it? If our past is, in essence, a construct, if key narratives were deliberately shaped, what does that imply about our understanding of progress, of human nature, of the very foundations of our societies?
It makes you think about power and control.
Exactly. It challenges us to think critically about how information is controlled, how narratives are built, and how that shapes our collective identity, maybe even today.
Okay, let's shift our focus now to the Renaissance. This is a period most of us recognize as, well, a monumental turning point in human intellect, art, and society.
Oh, definitely. Conventionally, we celebrate it as this vibrant resurgence of classical antiquity, marking a profound evolution in how individuals saw themselves and their place in the world.
Right, this shift towards anthropocentrism focus on the human critical thinking, empirical observation. It all laid crucial groundwork for what came later, like the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution.
Absolutely. And a prime example often cited is Leon Battista Alberti's De Pictura. Published around 1435, it was really the first comprehensive scientific treatise dedicated to linear perspective.
And that revolutionized art and engineering, how people could represent reality on a flat surface.
It truly did. And Alberti himself seems to embody that quintessential ideal of the Renaissance man.
He really does. An Italian polymath of just astonishing breadth. Writer, artist, architect, poet, priest, linguist, philosopher, and cryptographer.
And he didn't just practice these fields, he fundamentally reshaped them, like redefining the architect not just a builder, but a learned designer of overarching principles.
It's fascinating, though, that when Alberti famously declared, "We painters," he was apparently speaking more as a theoretician, not really as a practicing artist himself.
That's right. Giorgio Vasari, in his famous Lives of the Artists, actually noted that Alberti achieved nothing of any great importance or beauty with the brush. He apparently preferred writing to applied work.
Interesting. So more of an intellectual, a theorist.
Which, as Alberta points out, is strikingly echoed later in Leonardo da Vinci's own notebooks. They're just filled with detailed studies clearly influenced by Alberti's ideas on beauty and proportion.
And Alberti's influence was huge. His treatise, Della Pittura, transformed Florentine art, and its principles even echo in later neoclassicism. You can see it in buildings like the White House and the U.S. Capitol.
Now, this is where Alberta's perspective takes a sharp turn. The Renaissance also saw, of course, the monumental invention of the printing press.
Which we normally see as a great thing, revolutionizing knowledge, making it accessible.
That's the traditional view, monumental innovation, democratizing knowledge. However, Alberta posits a far darker side to this invention.
Okay.
Before the press, he argues, history was preserved in these relatively few ephemeral manuscripts. They were easy to forge, sure, but also easy to destroy or modify. Limited reach.
Makes sense.
But with the press's arrival in the 15th century, suddenly you could mass-produce texts. And Alberta claims a flood of historical classics and approved texts were printed and distributed widely.
And this, according to Alberta, is what actually solidified a forged historical narrative across Europe.
That's his argument. He introduces this idea of the watch, a supposed covert intelligentsia that shrewdly capitalized on this new technology.
The watch. Why that name?
It apparently has a double meaning, signifying both a timepiece relating to chronology and also the ever-present gaze of those who surveil and control. This sophisticated network, he claims, strategically leveraged the printing press to facilitate a full range of counterfeits, enabling the swift and extensive circulation of meticulously fabricated historical narratives.
Wow. And Alberti himself, where does he fit into this more controversial picture?
Well, here's where it gets really provocative. In his earliest years, Alberta claims Alberti worked squarely within this hidden framework. His acknowledged mastery of language, architecture, and cryptography reportedly made him one of the watch's most valued operatives.
Why him specifically?
Because he was uniquely capable, Alberta suggests, of blending genuine artistic brilliance with precise historical manipulation. His architectural projects, for instance, often coincided suspiciously with the unveiling of ancient texts that just happened to reinforce the legitimacy of his patron's rule. Initially, his loyalty was supposedly firmly with their mission of constructing an authoritative, seamless version of the past.
That's a really bold assertion. What kind of evidence does Alberta point to for this idea of widespread fabrication during the Renaissance?
He points to contemporary records, things like inventories of early incunabula. Those are the books printed right at the dawn of printing, before 1501.
Right.
These inventories, from major European libraries, apparently show a huge, disproportionate number of rediscovered ancient texts appearing suddenly within a very tight 20-year window, just a decade or so after Gutenberg's Bible.
That does seem like a remarkably rapid flood of ancient knowledge suddenly surfacing all at once.
It does. And then there's the kicker you mentioned earlier, the suspicious similarities within these texts.
Ah, yes, the identical errors and things.
Exactly. These rediscovered works often shared things like identical line breaks, marginalia placement, and rare linguistic quirks. Minor details, but consistent across copies found in different places.
Which wouldn't make sense if they came from different independent manuscript traditions that had survived for centuries.
Precisely. Alberta argues it's a strong indicator of a single editorial origin, like finding 100 copies of a supposedly ancient document, all with the exact same typos, suggesting they all came from one, possibly recent, master copy, not diverse ancient sources.
So the watch's influence wasn't just in creating these texts, according to this theory. They were also the gatekeepers of knowledge.
Yeah.
How do they manage that level of control?
Their authority, Alberta claims, was cemented through pervasive influence, maybe even control over key societal institutions.
Like what?
Prominent libraries, the burgeoning universities that were starting up, influential religious bodies. All of these functioned as crucial gatekeepers of knowledge. This strategic positioning allowed them, supposedly, to meticulously curate historical records, decide what got preserved and copied, and subtly shape the intellectual frameworks through which humanity understood its own past.
You know, this isn't just about old books and dusty archives, is it?
Hmm.
This really hits at how information control, even through seemingly neutral technologies like the printing press back then or maybe the internet today, can fundamentally alter our understanding of collective identity, of legitimate authority. It definitely makes you wonder about the narratives we consume uncritically today.
It certainly provides food for thought.
Okay, if Alberti was supposedly so central to this watch and its alleged operations, let's really unpack who this polymath was. Why was his specific genius so critical to their mission, according to Alberta? We know his scope was astonishing.
Right. Writer, artist, architect, poet, priest, linguist, philosopher, cryptographer. The list goes on.
And beyond just the art and architecture, he was deeply interested in the meaning behind forms, wasn't he?
Yes, he imbued geometric forms with profound symbolic resonance. He even applied principles of sacred proportion to the design of Vatican altars. His systematic analysis of natural phenomena led to that comprehensive account of perspective we talked about.
Which he then spread widely using the new printing press.
Exactly. And his later architectural work, De Re Edificatoria, earned him that nickname Florentine Vitruvius because he asserted mathematics as this universal common ground bridging both art and science.
And then there's the cryptography. He's widely recognized as the father of European cryptography. How does his pioneering work in that secret world tie into this larger theory of historical manipulation?
Well, that's a really critical piece of the puzzle in Alberta's view. Alberti invented the first polyalphabetic cipher around 1467, the Alberti cipher.
Can you explain that simply?
Sure. Imagine maybe two rotating disks, one inside the other, each with a mixed-up alphabet on it. You line them up according to a secret key, and it scrambles the letters of your message. It makes it incredibly hard for someone without the key and the disk to break the code.
Much stronger than simple substitution ciphers.
Oh, vastly. It was revolutionary. And it was specifically designed, Alberta emphasizes, to safeguard sensitive intelligence from prying eyes.
So secret communication was a serious business back then, espionage and statecraft.
Absolutely. Both royal courts and the powerful church invested heavily in it. They financed dedicated cadres of code makers and code breakers.
And the Vatican used Alberti.
Yes, the Vatican apparently employed Alberti not just for his expertise in designing physical fortifications, but also for securing their confidential correspondence using his cipher methods.
What about that emblem of his, the winged eye?
Ah, yes. His self-portrait even depicts him with his distinctive winged eye emblem. Alberta notes he later encased it within a triangle, which is often seen as symbolizing the Christian Trinity. It's this interesting blend of personal identity, spiritual belief, and maybe, just maybe, a subtle nod to hidden knowledge or surveillance, the all-seeing eye.
It's also fascinating that Alberti's big architectural book, De Re Edificatoria, seems to intentionally echo Vitruvius's De Architectura from ancient Rome. It was like he was positioning himself as the new Vitruvius.
It was a very deliberate connection he made. And this leads us straight into one of the most controversial speculations Alberta discusses, doesn't it?
The idea that Alberti's identity might actually be conflated with Vitruvius himself, that the Roman architect Vitruvius, supposedly living around 7015 BC, might somehow be Alberti.
Yes, it sounds wild, but Alberta points to some circumstantial evidence cited by others. For example, marginalia notes written in the margins found in a 15th century Latin edition of Vitruvius.
Okay.
Paleographers, handwriting experts have identified the script as closely matching Alberti's known handwriting. And the notes include corrections to Vitruvius that actually align better with Alberti's own architectural theories, diverging from classical Vitruvian principles.
So it's like finding notes in a very old textbook that seem to have been written by a modern-day scholar correcting the original author based on later ideas.
Kind of like that, yeah. It's intriguing, to say the least.
And it gets even more provocative. You mentioned Anatoli Fomenko earlier.
Right, the Russian mathematician. In the late 20th century, using statistical text analysis methods, Fomenko went so far as to assert that the two individuals, Alberti and Vitruvius, were statistically likely to be one and the same.
Wow. That's a huge claim.
It is. And Alberta notes this idea finds sort of an intriguing resonance, maybe with Leonardo da Vinci's famous Vitruvian Man drawing. Remember the mirrored script Leonardo used in his notebook?
Yes, the backward writing.
Alberta suggests it invites a playful, almost cryptographic association with Alberti's theories of proportion, and perhaps this whole identity question.
Now, it's important to say these kinds of claims, Alberti being Vitruvius, are way outside mainstream academic scholarship.
Oh, absolutely. Way outside. But what is undisputed is Alberti's astonishing polymathic scope within his own time. He pioneered the standardization of Italian grammar. He meticulously refined medieval Latin for papal communications. He practiced Roman law. He oversaw the extensive collection and preservation of ancient manuscripts.
And the fragility of ancient writing materials like papyrus is key here, right? Alberta argues this meant anything not meticulously recopied onto expensive parchment would inevitably just disintegrate over time.
Exactly. And this pervasive vulnerability, he argues, underscores a fundamental and enduring question. How can we truly ascertain what is genuinely original from antiquity in the historical record versus what might be a later copy or even a reconstruction or fabrication?
This brings us back to the encrypted timeline hypothesis. Alberti's documented mastery of ciphers prompts what Alberta calls a profoundly thought-provoking inquiry.
Could the very timeline of the historical record itself be encrypted in a similar fashion? Could it be deliberately encoded, concealing deeper truths beneath its apparent straightforward linearity?
It reframes history completely.
It does. From this perspective, things like foreign intelligence, espionage, covert operations, these emerge as potentially critical missing elements in the conventional understanding of how historical scholarship developed.
So it's like Alberta is constantly saying, think of the official timeline as that master forgery. Beautiful, skillfully aged maybe, but painted over the top of another image. And our task is to try and scrape away that upper layer.
That's the challenge he puts forward.
You know, this isn't just about dusty old dates and names. It taps into that deep human fascination with codes, hidden meanings, secrets. The idea that powerful figures throughout history might have been playing a completely different game than the one we've been taught.
It definitely makes you wonder about the layers of information potentially hidden in plain sight, even today.
Now, this radical redating of history, this chronological compression, it isn't entirely unique to Alberta's work, is it? You mentioned he builds on an even more provocative idea.
That's right. His analysis actually builds on, or at least intersects with, an idea developed by Russian mathematicians, most notably Anatoli Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky. They call it the New Chronology, often abbreviated as TNC.
Okay, the new chronology.
Now, Alberta, in his book, is careful to clarify that he doesn't necessarily fully agree with TNC's specific revised timeline down to the year, but he does seem to build on their overarching premise.
Which is?
That much of recorded history, particularly ancient and early medieval history, was essentially fabricated or radically misinterpreted, primarily during the 15th to 17th centuries, significantly aided by the invention of the printing press.
So both see the Renaissance and the printing press as pivotal moments for potential large-scale historical revision.
Exactly. Alberta's analysis, though, tends to prioritize narratives he feels are omitted from both mainstream history and even from alternative discourses like TNC. He puts a particular focus, as we've seen, on Alberti's alleged foundational role in this fabrication.
And what's the core idea of TNC itself, the one Fomenko champions?
TNC's core idea is even more extreme, really. It suggests that the current version of history, the one we all learn, is essentially a patchwork of 3 to 4 duplicate versions of the same core set of events.
Duplicate versions, what does that mean?
It means the same historical happenings were supposedly recorded multiple times, but shifted in time and geography, given different names, different actors, different places. Fomenko calls these phantom reflections.
So in this framework, where does that place figures and events we think of as ancient, before the 15th century?
In the TNC revised framework, essentially all major events and figures traditionally dated before the 11th century, and many dated before the 15th, are dramatically repositioned much later, primarily within the 11th, 14th centuries.
Not all of them. That includes
what we typically call ancient civilizations: Iraq, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and consequently all the major wars typically associated with those ancient periods.
So campaigns like the Egyptian conflicts, the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests, the Greco-Persian wars.
Yep. The Peloponnesian War, the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, the early Islamic conquests, the Crusades, the Mongol invasions, even the 100 Years' War.
all of these are redated as essentially medieval events, not ancient ones.
According to TNC, yes. They argue that mainstream history generally has the correct sequence of major events relative to each other.
Okay, the order is roughly right.
But the dating, the absolute placement on the timeline, is often wildly inaccurate, sometimes off by centuries, or even, they claim, millennia.
This sounds like a fundamental challenge to the very methods we use to date things. What specific issues does Alberta, maybe drawing on TNC or his own analysis, raise with conventional dating methods like radiocarbon dating?
He expresses deep skepticism, particularly about radiocarbon dating, or C14, results obtained before its calibration curves were significantly refined, mostly from the 1980s onwards.
And why the skepticism?
Well, the method relies fundamentally on the assumption that the concentration of radioactive carbon-14 in the atmosphere has remained relatively stable over time.
And has it?
Not really. We know that major events like large volcanic eruptions, the onset of widespread industrial pollution, and especially above-ground nuclear testing in the 20th century have significantly distorted these atmospheric carbon levels.
Which throws off the calculations for older samples.
It can, potentially leading to significant inaccuracies, especially for dates further back in time or before good calibration data existed. Alberta points to documented cases where C14 dating initially gave results that contradicted known historical records.
Like that medieval shroud example.
Exactly. A famous case involved a medieval shroud, which initially returned a C14 date, suggesting it originated somewhere between 200 BC and AD 200. Much later analysis, using refined calibration, shifted that date forward by more than 1,000 years, placing it squarely in the Middle Ages, consistent with other evidence.
So his position isn't that C14 is useless.
Not at all. He acknowledges it's a valuable tool, but argues its results are only as trustworthy as the chain of custody of the sample, the calibration curves used, and the interpretive framework surrounding them. Context is everything.
So it's not that these scientific methods are completely invalid in his view, but that their results depend heavily on the assumptions in the historical framework you're already working within.
Precisely. It can become a bit circular.
It really makes you pause and think about how confident we can be about very ancient dates. What about other dating methods? Does he critique those too?
Yes, he raises questions about others as well. Dendrochronology, the tree ring dating.
Right.
He suggests it's sometimes artificially constructed by cross-matching fragments from different locations or times, relying on assumed historical timelines to link them up. So again, potentially circular reasoning.
And stratigraphy, the layers in the ground.
Often misinterpreted, he argues, due to soil disturbances, erosion, human activity, mixing layers up. It's not always as neat as textbook diagrams suggest.
Okay.
And many archaeological finds end up being contextually dated. This means they're assigned ages based primarily on the other artifacts found around them, rather than through direct dating of the object itself.
Which, again, sounds potentially circular if the surrounding artifacts were misdated.
Then the new find gets misdated too, reinforcing the potentially incorrect timeline. Alberta argues this can lead to circular reasoning and prior assumptions, making chronologies heavily dependent on pre-existing historical frameworks that might themselves be flawed.
Okay, now here's a truly fascinating and, frankly, unsettling claim Alberta discusses. The idea that distinct major epidemics recorded in history, like the so-called Plague of Athens during the Peloponnesian War, the Antonine Plague in the Roman Empire, or the Plague of Justinian in the Byzantine era, are actually phantom reflections.
Or fractal copies, as he puts it.
Fractal copies of what?
Of the devastating 14th century Black Death.
So these earlier plagues maybe didn't happen as distinct events, but are echoes of the Black Death inserted into earlier historical periods.
That's the provocative claim. Fractal copies implies they replicate the same essential patterns of devastation and symptoms, maybe scaled differently across time, almost like a repeating geometric pattern you see in nature, but applied to historical plagues.
What's the evidence for such a radical idea?
Well, Alberta highlights that some medical historians have noted striking similarities in the descriptions. Symptom descriptions in these supposedly much earlier accounts often seem to match 14th century plague records almost word for word.
Word for word, seriously.
He cites analyses comparing, for example, the Greek historian Thucydides' famous account of the Plague of Athens with a 14th century chronicle of the Black Death written by Gabriel de Musis. One linguistic analysis apparently found that over 40% of symptom phrases appear verbatim in translation between the two texts.
Over 40% verbatim. That's astounding. That doesn't sound like two independent observers describing different diseases centuries apart.
It certainly suggests, Alberta argues, direct copying or adaptation rather than independent eyewitness testimony.
Okay, if that's the case, what would be the purpose of creating these phantom reflections of the Black Death and placing them earlier in the timeline?
According to Alberta's interpretation, the purpose was twofold. First, to artificially create a false sense of deep antiquity for the existing historical narratives of Greece and Rome, making them seem older and more established.
And second,
Second, to provide a fabricated explanation for why advanced knowledge and sophisticated societies supposedly collapsed or disappeared before the Renaissance. These phantom plagues could be blamed for historical dark ages.
so it offered a convenient narrative of historical ebb and flow, decline, and rebirth, masking what Alberta suggests might be a much more recent, compressed timeline for civilization's development.
That seems to be the implication. From this re-envisioned perspective, history itself starts to look less like a factual record and more like a cryptogram.
A cryptogram, like a coded message.
Yeah, specifically, Alberta likens it to a substitution cipher, the kind where you swap one letter for another throughout a message. He suggests history might be like that, but with events, names, and dates swapped around.
And how do you solve a substitution cipher?
Through frequency analysis, typically. You look for patterns, repeated elements. And this connects back to Fomenko's mathematical approach.
Ah, right. He approached history like a giant coded text.
Exactly. He applied statistical models to historical texts, comparing dynasties, reigns, events, almost like analyzing linguistic DNA. And he claimed to find striking correlations, like statistical fingerprints, between historical periods that conventional history places centuries apart.
Like his example of early Rome and late medieval Rome, or Renaissance Florence.
Precisely. He found high statistical correlations suggesting that the narrative of early Rome might be a duplicated narrative or a phantom reflection of events actually occurring in late medieval Rome or Italy. He even recalculated ancient astronomical records like eclipse timings and argued they line up better with calculated dates in the Middle Ages, not antiquity.
This isn't about dismissing science, then, but about critically examining the assumptions that underpin how we apply scientific tools like dating methods or statistical analysis to history.
And recognizing how historical narratives themselves can be actively shaped, perhaps even manipulated, through subtle acts like assigning dates or describing events in ways that echo other periods.
It certainly challenges us to look beyond the surface of accepted timelines and ask tougher questions about the evidence.
Definitely.
Okay, let's transition now to another profoundly thought-provoking theory that Alberta weaves into this rewritten chronology. Julian Jaynes's concept of the bicameral mind. This comes from Jaynes's book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind.
Yes, Jaynes was an American psychologist, and his theory is quite radical. He posited that humans, perhaps as recently as the medieval period, and certainly earlier, fundamentally lacked modern self-awareness as we experience it today.
Lacked self-awareness. What does that mean? They weren't conscious.
Not exactly unconscious, but conscious in a very different way. Jaynes suggested that these individuals weren't making conscious internal decisions, weighing options in their head like we do. Instead, he believed they were primarily governed by and obeyed auditory hallucinations.
Hallucinations. Like hearing voices.
Yes, auditory hallucinations that they perceived as external commands, often emanating from gods, ancestors, or kings. These voices originated, Jaynes theorized, from a specific area in the brain, perhaps the right hemisphere, hence bicameral, meaning two chambers. One part spoke, the other obeyed.
Wow. And how long did this state persist?
According to Jaynes, this cognitive state, bicameralism, might have been the dominant mode of human mentality until relatively recently. He proposed it began to break down under stress, possibly starting with major societal collapses, maybe intensifying during the plague years, and perhaps culminating during the widespread upheavals of the Renaissance, like the fall of Constantinople in 1453.
So the rise of modern consciousness was linked to societal breakdown.
That was Jaynes's idea. The breakdown forced the emergence of introspective consciousness, the ability to think about thinking, to have an internal narrative self. He saw it as a multi-phase collapse of that older bicameral cognition.
That's a truly mind-bending idea. What's fascinating is the multidisciplinary support that Alberta highlights for Jaynes' theory, connecting it to his own timeline.
Right. Neurologically, he points to brain lateralization studies showing distinct functional roles between the left and right cerebral hemispheres. The right hemisphere is often implicated in processing things like music, metaphor, and yes, auditory stimuli, which aligns somewhat with Jaynes's model of a God hemisphere generating commands.
And psychologically.
Psychologically, Alberta notes that the authoritative commanding voices experienced in certain clinical conditions like schizophrenia, PTSD, even sometimes in bereavement, echo the nature of the bicameral hallucinations Jaynes described. He suggests these might be enduring vestiges of that archaic cognitive mode.
Interesting. There's even some research suggesting genetic overlap and shared inflammatory pathways between conditions like schizophrenia and susceptibility to things like plague, right? Adding another potential layer.
It's complex, but there are suggestive links being explored.
And linguistically, this seems key.
Very key. Jaynes famously argued, and Alberta emphasizes this, that ancient texts, like Homer's The Iliad, conspicuously lack introspective language. Characters don't seem to sit and ponder choices or reflect on their feelings.
They just act.
They often act as if they're simply following direct divine commands or impulses. It's fascinating. Linguists have pointed out there are virtually no words in the Iliad that clearly correspond to concepts like mind, self, thought, or internal decision-making. Actions are attributed to gods, fate, or external forces.
But wait, if the Iliad is supposedly from ancient Greece, how does that fit with Alberta's Renaissance fabrication idea?
Well, here's the connection Alberta makes, linking Jaynes and the chronological revision. In his framework, works like the Iliad are not direct, pristine survivors from an ancient bicameral era.
They are.
They're likely Renaissance reconstructions, perhaps heavily edited, maybe compiled from fragments, possibly even largely reimagined, based on much older oral traditions. These oral sources, originating in genuinely bicameral societies, perhaps in the later Middle Ages, according to the revised timeline, would have preserved the linguistic and psychological markers.
Fabricators, maybe the Watch, transcribed or rediscovered and printed these texts.
They inadvertently preserved traces of that earlier bicameral mental world, even as they embedded it within a newly constructed, falsified timeline stretching back to a fabricated antiquity.
So when Jaynes' bicameral mind theory is integrated with something like the new chronology, it leads to a profoundly compressed view of humanity's historical timeline.
Exactly. What we call the Bronze Age collapse, for instance, might actually represent crises occurring much later, maybe in the late medieval period, according to TNC. And the final breakdown of the bicameral mind might have only reached its concluding phases during the Renaissance itself.
This implies that the shift from hallucinated divine commands to self-reflective thought, the emergence of what we consider modern consciousness, was potentially a much more recent development than we usually assume.
Possibly intrinsically linked to the profound upheavals and transformations of early modernity, the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, rather than being some gradual evolutionary step completed deep in antiquity.
Which would mean that both behavioral modernity and the very historical record we consult might be far more recent constructs than conventionally believed.
That's the radical implication Alberta explores.
Okay, so what about the Watch in this context? If most of humanity was largely bicameral until relatively recently, how did this alleged shadowy group operate? Were they bicameral too?
Alberta suggests not. He posits that prior to the complete emergence of humanism, which Alberti later helped codify, the vast majority of humanity did exist in this fundamentally different cognitive state, experiencing reality predominantly through perceived auditory hallucinations or divine commands.
But the Watch.
The Watch, however, supposedly comprised individuals who had, perhaps through unique circumstances or lineages, already transcended this bicameral mode of thought. They possessed or had developed a more modern introspective consciousness much earlier.
So they were operating with a different mindset among populations who weren't.
That's the idea. Their network of spies, scholars, and agents, having long operated with this advanced form of introspective consciousness, could move discreetly among populations still deeply influenced by these internal voices.
And they could manipulate that.
They could skillfully leverage this pervasive psychological reality to subtly guide and manipulate societal development. While the masses might implicitly obey perceived divine commands, the Watch understood these perhaps as predictable psychological responses, providing fertile ground for their covert guidance or control.
Wow. That adds another whole layer of potential manipulation. What role did writing and literacy play in this massive cognitive shift away from bicameralism?
Jaynes himself argued, and Alberta concurs, that the advent of writing was crucial. It helped guide humanity away from the bicameral mind by externalizing divine authority, moving it from internal voices to tangible, enduring symbols on stone, papyrus, or parchment.
And the printing press accelerated this.
Dramatically. The printing press further facilitated abstract thought, systematic record-keeping, complex legal frameworks, all things that diminish reliance on immediate auditory commands and encourage internal reflection and analysis.
And art and literature.
Also key, the rise of realistic portraiture, focusing on the individual face and expression, and the development of first-person narratives in literature, these actively cultivated introspection and the sense of an internal self.
You know, this isn't just a fascinating abstract theory. It really asks you to consider how profoundly human consciousness itself may have evolved, maybe even quite recently, and how that evolution might be deeply intertwined with the very history we record and the narratives we tell ourselves.
It definitely challenges our assumptions about the very nature of human thought through time.
Let's expand now on the purported global reach of the watch and their alleged role as masters of deception and influence. Alberta posits that Alberti wasn't just a member, but was eventually at the helm of a transnational intelligence network.
Yes, a network specializing profoundly in the art of secrecy. And what supposedly united its diverse members, artists, scholars, bankers, churchmen, their shared mastery of cryptanalysis.
Codes were the key.
Codes allowed for discrete, covert communication across borders, even in public spaces, forming the invisible connective tissue of this alleged network.
And this network, Alberta claims, included some of the most renowned figures of the Renaissance who collectively cultivated a sophisticated culture of forgery.
Right. He suggests figures like Giotto, Masaccio, Brunelleschi, Pier della Francesca, even Michelangelo weren't just artists, but were involved, perhaps knowingly or unknowingly, in producing remarkably convincing historical fakes.
Through art and architecture.
Yes, by creating paintings, sculptures, and buildings that seem to embody classical ideals or depict historical scenes in ways that served as tangible evidence for a systematically rewritten history, projecting a fabricated antiquity back in time.
The web of connections Alberta draws here, if this theory holds any water, is just dizzying. He claims that once Alberti successfully integrated the young Leonardo da Vinci into his network.
Da Vinci began designing a wide array of military and espionage equipment. We know about his designs for things like parachutes, tanks, diving suits.
Yeah, his famous notebooks.
Alberta suggests these innovative designs were then deliberately and deceptively presented as reproductions or rediscoveries of Greek antiques, as a strategic maneuver that effectively backdated advanced technology, making it seem like sophisticated knowledge existed much earlier than it did.
This created then a false sense of antiquity and propagated that convenient narrative of lost knowledge that would just happen to be rediscovered during the Renaissance.
Exactly. Alberta points to examples like the treatises attributed to Hero of Alexandria, detailing complex devices powered by water, air, and steam. These supposedly magically reappeared in Europe during the Renaissance.
And the timing seems suspicious to him.
The precise timing of these rediscoveries, Alberta writes, appears far too exact to be dismissed as mere coincidence. He even suggests we might need to interpret some historical dates found on artifacts not as literal chronology, but rather as serial numbers or coded references used by this network.
Wow, it makes you wonder how many inventions we credit to antiquity were perhaps actually sophisticated Renaissance-era creations, deliberately misattributed.
It's a radical thought. Consider Luca Pacioli, often called the father of accounting. He's credited with publishing the first detailed description of the double-entry accounting system in the late 15th century.
A cornerstone of modern business.
Absolutely. Yet Alberta points out that principles remarkably similar to double-entry bookkeeping appear to be prefigured in Pliny the Elder's Tabulae Rationum, supposedly from 70 AD.
Okay, so if it existed back then,
it immediately provokes a critical inquiry. If such a sophisticated financial methodology existed in antiquity, why is there essentially no evidence of its continuous and uninterrupted use for over a millennium? Where did it go?
this enigmatic void, as Alberta calls it.
Yes. This apparent gap in the historical record, where an advanced financial system seemingly vanished before its perplexing rediscovery centuries later, profoundly reinforces the hypothesis that such sophisticated knowledge was intentionally suppressed, he argues. He even mentions merchant ledgers showing abrupt returns to simpler single-entry systems after periods of using more complex methods, suggesting perhaps a premeditated strategy of knowledge control.
And the Medici family. They were hugely powerful in Florence during Alberti's time. How do they fit in?
Alberta claims the Medici, arguably the wealthiest family on Earth then, played a crucial role. They cleverly championed the elaborate narratives of an ancient Roman and Greek past.
Why would they do that?
To legitimize their own relatively recent rise to power, their aspirations for influence within the church, and maybe even to establish enduring regal dynasties. Associating themselves with a glorious, perhaps fabricated antiquity gave them prestige and authority.
And the Alberti family actually preceded the Medici in banking, didn't they?
Interestingly, yes. The Alberti family were direct institutional forerunners in Florentine banking before the Medici's ascendance. Their bank eventually collapsed, partly due to political turmoil.
And the Medici bank then rose.
Yes, after the Alberti bank's collapse, the Medici gradually superseded them, establishing their bank in 1397 and building upon, Alberta suggests, and further refining the innovative banking systems originally introduced by the Alberti family.
What was Alberti's personal relationship with the Medici?
It seems complex. Alberta notes that while Alberti admired Cosimo de' Medici's patronage of arts and learning, and they shared certain Neoplatonic philosophical leanings, Alberti was not financially beholden to the family. This apparently enabled a more detached, independent relationship than many other artists and scholars had.
Though Alberti did design for them.
Yes, he designed their famous villa in Fiesole, which established the prototype for many subsequent Renaissance villas. He also organized the Certamen Coronarium in 1441, a poetry contest aimed at promoting the vernacular Tuscan language, which Cosimo supported.
And the Florentine Academy, fostered by Cosimo, became central.
Alberta portrays the academy as a strategic recruiting ground for talented artists and scholars. These individuals were then subtly mobilized, he claims, to wage war on historical perception, systematically reshaping the cultural legacy of Europe to align with the philosophical and political ambitions of patrons like the Medici.
And figures like Poggio Bracciolini, famous for discovering lost classical texts.
Alberta suggests Bracciolini, celebrated for recovering texts by Cicero, Lucretius, and others, may have instead been a master forger, perhaps fabricating or significantly altering manuscripts like Cicero's political works or Lucretius's Atomism poem, the Rerum Natura, to serve the Medici's political needs and legitimize more secular philosophical ideas.
This web of alleged influence extends even further, doesn't it? Into the Age of Discovery.
Yes. Remember Alberti's potential alias, Vitruvius? Alberta notes that Vitruvius dedicated his architectural treatise to influential military and political figures, just as Alberti often did. And Vitruvius's book, De Architectura, supposedly inspired many Roman monuments, yet wasn't widely circulated or copied until the Renaissance. Again, suggesting strategic knowledge suppression and reintroduction.
And then there's the Marco Polo connection.
A truly startling claim Alberta discusses involves the uncanny parallels drawn by some researchers between the narrative of Marco Polo's travels and the name Marcus Polio, which was Vitruvius's cognomen or surname.
Suggesting
That the watch, perhaps through Alberta Vitruvius, possessed advanced knowledge of the New World, or at least Asia, long before Christopher Columbus. They even question Marco Polo's purported travels, noting he makes no mention of the Great Wall of China, and his birth details remain oddly obscure.
Okay, that's stretching things, maybe, but the connections keep coming. Amerigo Vespucci.
Right. Alberta points out that Alberti's architectural treatise De Re Edificatoria, finished around 1452, was dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici. Decades later, Lorenzo apparently provided Amerigo Vespucci with geographical coordinates that allegedly guided him to the Inca and Aztec empires.
So Vespucci's voyages, and the subsequent naming of America after him, are presented by Alberta as potentially another clear instance of the watch's manipulation of historical narratives and prior knowledge.
It fits the pattern he's describing. And consider Paolo Toscanelli, the Florentine cosmographer. He is known to have collaborated with Alberti on advanced map-making techniques incorporating astronomy, which resulted in Alberti's map Descriptio Urbis Romae.
And Toscanelli famously provided Columbus with the map that guided his voyage westward.
Exactly. It creates a documented link. Alberti develops advanced cartography with Toscanelli. Toscanelli provides the map to Columbus. It potentially places Alberti's sophisticated geographical and astronomical knowledge right at the dawn of the European Age of Discovery.
Even Ptolemy's famous star catalog, the cornerstone of ancient astronomy.
TNC proponents, and Alberta discusses this, claim statistical analysis shows it was likely compiled or heavily revised in the 15th century because the documented star positions allegedly match Renaissance-era skies much better than ancient ones.
This whole section highlights this dizzying interconnectedness Alberta proposes between power, finance, art, science, cryptography, exploration, and potentially massive deception. It suggests even the names on our maps or the inventions we credit to antiquity could be part of a larger orchestrated design.
It definitely makes you look at the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery through a much darker, more conspiratorial lens if you follow his logic. It makes you wonder what else might be hiding in plain sight.
Okay, here's where the narrative Alberta constructs takes a really pivotal turn. It's a truly compelling twist in his telling of Alberti's story. He suggests that towards the end of his life, Alberti began to reassess the mission he had served.
Yes, after supposedly being a principal architect, literally and figuratively, of the watch's manufactured antiquity, his exposure to wider humanist currents and his own deep philosophical reflections led him, Alberta claims, to a radical conclusion.
Which was?
That the watch's monopoly over knowledge, their tight control over the historical narrative, was ultimately not preserving civilization, but stifling it. It was preventing genuine progress and understanding.
So, a change of heart, a crisis of conscience.
Perhaps. Alberta portrays it as the ultimate aha moment for Alberti. With his keen insight into codes, networks, and information control, Alberti recognized that the very cryptanalytic skills and expansive cross-border networks that had once been exploited for clandestine forgeries could be strategically redirected. His new vision, Alberta suggests, was to employ these same tools to actively dismantle the watch's pervasive stranglehold on historical narratives.
Wow. So the master forger becomes the master deconstructor, using the same tools.
Exactly. The very tools Alberti once allegedly used to craft this historical illusion, his mastery of codes, his understanding of networks, his influence on the new technology of the printing press, became the very instruments he now envisioned using to dismantle it.
So instead of letting secret societies wield the printing press to fabricate ancient authorities and control information,
Alberti envisioned universal literacy as a formidable cultural counterweapon.
Universal literacy. How would that work as a counterweapon?
His strategy, as Alberta outlines it, involved actively popularizing the alphabet, promoting critical reading skills, and saturating Europe with inexpensive printed texts. But not just any texts.
Texts that would expose the manipulations.
Yes, texts that would subtly or perhaps overtly expose the manipulated chronologies and fabricated histories. Even the artful remixes of influential figures like Michelangelo, which had maybe functioned as clever deceptions embedded in art.
Could be recontextualized.
Exactly. Recontextualized to become visual footnotes for genuinely reliable narratives. This whole effort, he believed, would ultimately empower an informed public to decipher the past for themselves and directly challenge any predetermined global order imposed by the watch.
And humanism, the philosophical movement sweeping Europe at the time, was key to this.
Alberta argues it provided the essential intellectual framework for this profound potential revolution.
How so?
By elevating rational inquiry, critical thinking, and affirming the inherent dignity and potential of the individual, humanism offered a powerful, secular philosophical language. This language could unite diverse populations across Europe without relying on the traditional theological gatekeeping imposed by Rome or other centralized religious authorities.
It offered an alternative basis for shared values and understanding.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And paradoxically, Alberta points out, Alberti's own architectural projects for the Vatican illustrate how he might have strategically utilized these very institutions of power. By using his influence in projects to subtly propagate a more accessible Italian vernacular language over the elite and restrictive Latin that dominated church and scholarly communication. Promoting the common tongue weakened the grip of those who controlled the ancient languages.
So, in skillfully emphasizing shared human values through humanism, while also subtly encouraging the development and use of local languages like Italian, Alberti was navigating a very delicate balance.
Alberta suggests his actions simultaneously weakened both clerical dogma and the watch's pan-European information cartel, which relied on controlling elite languages and ancient texts. At the same time, he was meticulously nurturing the very civic pride and local identity tied to vernacular language that would later burgeon into nationalism.
Alberta describes this not as a sudden dramatic break, but a gradual drift in Alberti's later life. A man once at the very center of the watch's grand illusion, now repurposing its machinery to try and loosen the very chains he had helped to forge.
It paints him as moving from a fabricator of the past to a potential liberator of the future.
And this ties back to the shift in consciousness too, right? The move away from bicameralism.
Yes, Alberta suggests these developments were concurrent and interconnected. As 15th century culture shifted, as social structures grew more complex through urbanization and trade, as intercultural contact broadened.
People encountered a multitude of conflicting belief systems.
Exactly, and these emergent tensions progressively eroded the authority of singular, unchallenged divine voices, whether internal or external.
And catastrophic events, like plagues or wars, further destabilized traditional societal structures.
Leading, Janes might argue, and Alberta echoes, to a profound fracturing of that psychological bicameral psyche. In response to these overwhelming pressures, humans increasingly began to internalize authority,
Developing what we'd call a conscience.
cultivating an autonomous conscience capable of more sophisticated moral reasoning, internal deliberation, and flexible decision-making, rather than just obeying perceived commands.
So collectively, these converging forces, humanism, literacy, social upheaval, the breakdown of bicameralism forged, in this view, an entirely new mode of human consciousness.
One characterized by self-direction, introspection, and a liberation from dependence on singular divine commands. It's quite an inspiring thought, really, the idea that humanity, perhaps guided by figures like the reformed Alberti, consciously evolved its way out of a perceived system of control towards greater autonomy.
We've certainly navigated a truly audacious claim in this deep dive. The idea that history, as we know it, is not necessarily a linear progression of discovered facts, but potentially a carefully constructed narrative.
Orchestrated possibly by a shadowy group during the Renaissance using brilliant figures like Alberti, initially at least, as their operatives. It definitely challenges us to reconsider how much of what we accept as historical fact might actually be a deliberately crafted illusion.
It really does. And it raises a profound question, doesn't it? What if this deep dive isn't just a fascinating historical curiosity, a what if about the distant past?
What if it's actually a kind of map? A way to understand the hidden structures of power and information control that might still be shaping our present and our future.
If history could be rewritten so fundamentally back then, what does that mean for the narratives we're being fed today, through vastly more powerful media?
It's a sobering thought.
This deep dive really challenges us, and hopefully you, the listener, to ask, what other master forgeries might still be dictating our understanding of reality right now?
And perhaps more importantly, what intellectual lockpicks? What critical thinking tools might you need to develop to discover them for yourself?
If you found this deep dive as fascinating and maybe as unsettling as we did, you can explore these ideas much further. You can download the entire audiobook of Encrypted Reality and retrieve supplemental material, including graphics, charts, and related resources Alberta provides.
Directly from Michael Anthony Alberta's website. That's michaelanthonyalberta.com.
michaelanthonyalberta.com. Dive in, get the lockpicks, and interrogate history for yourself.